What if I told you modern Danes are not descended from Denmark's very first people at all? We think we know the story. A proud Viking nation, carrying the blood of warriors who carved runes, raised longships, and stormed foreign shores. But science has pulled back the curtain, and what lies beneath doesn't just challenge that myth, it destroys it. When archaeologists dug into Denmark's ancient soil, they didn't just find tools, bones and burials, they found DNA, preserved in 10,000-year-old teeth, locked in skeletons pulled from peat bogs, even trapped inside hardened lumps of birch pitch chewing gum, spat out by hunter-gatherers long before the first stones of Copenhagen were ever laid, and when that DNA was sequenced, the results were shocking. Instead of a single continuous lineage, Denmark's past revealed a violent rhythm of erasure. Not once, but twice, entire populations vanished, wiped away by waves of newcomers who carried different faces, different genes, different worlds. This wasn't gradual evolution, this was replacement. The paradox is staggering. Today, Denmark is one of the most genetically homogeneous nations in Europe, a land where modern people share striking similarities regardless of region. Yet the genetic record shows that this stability rests on a foundation of chaos. Between 11,700 years ago and 4,850 years ago, Denmark experienced two near-total turnovers. First, the hunter-gatherers who colonised the land after the Ice Age were almost completely erased by Anatolian farmers around 3,900 BCE. And then those same farmers were themselves erased, swept aside by Yamnaya steppe herders around 2,850 BCE. Ancient haplogroups prove it beyond doubt. The Mesolithic men carried haplogroup 1-2, once dominant across Scandinavia. Today, it survives in less than 3% of Danes. In its place, steppe-born haplogroups OI1 and OI1b took over, reshaping the genetic map forever. This is the contradiction at the heart of Danish identity, a nation that sees itself as ancient and unbroken, yet whose very blood tells the story of disappearances. The first Danes do not live on in the DNA of modern people. They are ghosts, buried in the soil, but absent from the veins of those who walk above it. So, who were these first forgotten Danes, and why does their DNA almost vanish from history? 11,700 years ago, as the glaciers melted, two peoples marched into an empty land and collided. The answer begins not in Viking halls, but in the silence after the Ice Age. Around 11,700 years ago, as the great glaciers retreated, Denmark was still a barren frontier, scarred by ice, but ready for life. And into this empty land, two very different peoples came marching. The first wave came from the south, Western hunter-gatherers, or WHG. They followed the reindeer herds north from what is now Germany and northern Denmark. They belonged to the Arensberg culture, masters of the bow, stone points, and survival in a raw, icy world. Their genes carried a signature look, dark skin, with striking blue eyes. But soon from the northeast other people arrived, the Eastern hunter-gatherers, or YHG. Descended from groups in what is now Russia and Finland, they travelled along the newly opened Atlantic coast of Norway. Their appearance was different, paler skin, varied eye colours, and their own genetic legacy stretching deep into the east. When these two groups met in southern Scandinavia, something extraordinary happened. Instead of replacing one another, they mixed. For a brief moment in time, Denmark became one of the most genetically diverse places in all of Europe. DNA reveals this fusion was unique. No other region had such starkly different ancestries colliding so early. The proof lies not just in genomes, but in the tools left behind. Archaeologists long puzzled over a sudden shift in stone technology, a style that seemed to leap from Russia and Finland into Scandinavia. The genetic record solved the riddle. It was carried westward by the EHG migrants, who blended their blood and their tools with the WHG already here. We can still glimpse their faces. The Kolbjerg man, the oldest known skeleton from Denmark, lived around 10,000 years ago. His bones rest in a museum today, but his people, the first Danes, were erased so completely that his DNA carries no living descendants. But this genetic mosaic didn't last. Something far more powerful was on its way. And then it happened. In a single century, Denmark's first people, the hunter-gatherers who had thrived here for 5,000 years, were almost completely erased. Around 3900 BCE, the silence of the forests was broken by footsteps from the south. They were not warriors in the old sense, but they carried weapons far more devastating than spears. They brought seeds, livestock, and a way of life that would overturn everything. These were the funnel beaker farmers, the TRB culture, descendants of Anatolian migrants who had spread across Europe, their roots stretching back to the highlands of modern-day Turkey. At first glance, their impact seems cultural. They raised megalithic tombs, dolmens and passage graves, stone monuments that still tower in the Danish landscape. They crafted pottery, cultivated wheat and barley, and tethered animals where wild herds once roamed. But the real revolution wasn't visible in their tools, it was buried in their DNA. Genomic studies reveal a near total replacement of the foragers. The hunter-gatherer haplogroup I2, once carried by every Mesolithic man in Denmark, collapsed to almost nothing. In its place appeared the farmer lineages, mtDNA HKT2 and ydNAG2A. Within just a few generations, the genetic identity of Denmark flipped like a switch. The descendants of the Kolbjerg man, gone. A people erased not by slow blending, but by overwhelming replacement. The reasons are written in bones and pathogens. Some foragers fought, archaeologists have uncovered skeletons scarred by blunt force and arrows. But even greater killers arrived silently, carried in livestock. Diseases the hunters had no resistance to. Cattle-borne plagues, zoonotic infections, invisible waves of sickness. Violence and disease worked together, leaving little room for survival. And so the land of the hunter-gatherers became the land of farmers. The first Danes that history remembers were not the children of the Ice Age pioneers. They were outsiders, descendants of a migration that began thousands of miles away in the soils of Anatolia. But even these new Danes would not survive for long, because from the east, across the endless steppe, an unstoppable force was already on its way. From the Pontic-Caspian steppe, across thousands of miles, came a people who would rewrite Europe's DNA forever. Around 2850 BCE, the silence of Denmark's farmlands was shattered. The funnel beaker farmers who had raised stones into the sky and carved their lives into the soil faced an enemy unlike anything before. From the Black Sea, grasslands rode the yamnaya herders, pastoralists of the open steppe. They brought wagons, battle axes, and a new way of living, and with them they carried a genetic storm. Ancient genomes proved the scale of the takeover. Within just a few centuries, the people of Denmark were no longer Anatolian farmers. Their DNA now showed 60 to 85% steppe ancestry. The genetic imprint of the farmers collapsed to a faint echo. Just 3 to 18% survived. What happened here was not blending, it was replacement. The Yamnaya men left an especially brutal mark. male lineages shifted completely. Haplogroups R1a and R1b surged into dominance, while the old hunter-gatherer haplogroup RI2, once universal, was nearly erased. Archaeologists call this horizon the single grave culture, Denmark's branch of the wider corded ware phenomenon that swept across Europe like wildfire. But the invasion brought more than blood. It carried language. The roots of Indo-European speech, the ancestor of Danish and nearly every European tongue, spread with the yamnaya. Alongside their genes came new gods, new rituals, new burial customs, mounds rising from the earth to mark their dominance. And then one figure emerges from the shadows of time. A single male ancestor carrying haplogroup I1 appears during the Bronze Age. His lineage spreads like wildfire. Until today, millions of Scandinavians trace their paternal line back to him. One man, 3,000 years ago, fathering a genetic dynasty. This was not just an invasion. It was a reset. The yamnaya forged the blueprint of modern Danes. But hidden within this storm, they also planted strange genetic ghosts, echoes that would haunt Scandinavia for millennia. The very genes that gave Scandinavians their height and fair skin also cursed them. By 2000 BCE, the storm of the steppe had settled into Denmark's soil. What began as conquest now hardened into permanence. This was the dawn of the Nordic Bronze Age, a time of glittering metalwork, vast trade routes, and monumental burials. But beneath the cultural brilliance, something far more enduring was forged: the genetic map of Denmark. Ancient genomes show that by this time, Danes carried 70 to 80% steppe ancestry. The hunter-gatherers and Anatolian farmers were shadows now, their lineages reduced to faint whispers in the blood. What survived was the yamnaya imprint, locked so deeply that even 3,000 years later it remains the bedrock of Danish DNA. This inheritance reshaped the body itself. The Bronze Age Danes stood taller than their ancestors. Their skin grew lighter, better adapted to the northern sun. Many had blue or grey eyes and a powerful genetic tool, the ability to digest milk. This lactase persistence mutation, carried by the steppe herders, spread like wildfire, giving them an unmatched advantage in the north, where dairy became a staple of survival. But not all the gifts of the steppe were blessings. Scientists now know that along with height and pale skin came genetic risks. Variants that increased resilience against ancient plagues, also heightened vulnerability to autoimmune diseases. The fact that Northern Europe today shows the world's highest prevalence of multiple sclerosis may be the lingering ghost of this Bronze Age legacy. The archaeology deepens the picture. Across Denmark, burial mounds still rise, some towering 6 meters high. Within them, warriors were laid to rest with bronze swords, amber beads, and spiral ornaments. Trade routes stretched south into the Mediterranean, bringing gold, tin, and ideas. This was Denmark's first golden age, but it was built on the survival of a narrow few. Haplogroup 1-1, which appeared in this age, spread so explosively that nearly every modern Scandinavian man carrying it today descends from a single Bronze Age ancestor. One man, 3,000 years ago, fathering a lineage that still flows in millions of veins. And here is the revelation that rewrites history. The DNA that defines modern Danes is not Viking DNA. It is Bronze Age DNA, frozen into place long before the Viking Age began. So where do the Vikings fit in? Their genetic legacy is not what you've been told. The Viking wasn't born. The Viking was made. The Viking Age, from 793 to 1066 CE, is remembered as the moment when Scandinavia stepped onto the world stage. Long ships cut across oceans, monasteries burned, kingdoms trembled, and for centuries People believed this was the age when the true Danish bloodline was carved in iron. But the DNA tells another story. The Vikings were not a race. They were an identity, a mask that anyone could wear. Archaeogenetic studies reveal the shock. In Viking graves across Denmark, Norway and beyond, skeletons have been sequenced, and many of them weren't Scandinavian at all. In Orkney, Viking burials hold men with 2 British parents. In Sweden, bodies with Baltic ancestry. In Denmark itself, warriors with DNA tracing back to southern Europe, even Central Asia. These were not outsiders captured and enslaved. They were Vikings, buried with swords, runes and ships. The idea of a pure Viking bloodline dissolves the moment the genome is read. To be a Viking was to join a brotherhood of raiders, traders and settlers. A cultural passport, not a genetic one. And the expansion carried its own signature patterns. The Danes looked west, carving the Danelaw into England. The Norwegians sailed the Atlantic, reaching Ireland, Iceland, even Greenland. The Swedes pushed eastward into the Baltic and Russia. These routes left faint fingerprints in modern DNA, English ancestry in Danes, Irish traces in Norwegians, Baltic lines in Swedes. But the myth of a single Viking race, it collapses here. And this is where the paradox deepens. Because if Viking identity spread so far, if Danish warriors seeded their blood in England, Ireland and beyond, why does so little of it remain in Denmark itself? The answer is even stranger than the myth, because the Viking age changed Europe's DNA far more than it changed Denmark's. Foreign DNA flooded into Denmark during the Viking age, yet when we look at modern Danes, it's almost gone. How can an invasion of blood leave no trace? The Viking age should have transformed Denmark's gene pool forever. Ships sailed in every direction, carrying raiders, settlers, and slaves. Geneticists expected Denmark to hold a mosaic of lineages, reflecting centuries of contact with Britain, Ireland, the Baltics, even Asia. And for a brief time, it did. Studies of Viking-era skeletons reveal striking diversity. Warriors buried with Danish swords, yet carrying genomes from England, Scotland, Poland, and the Mediterranean. At its height, Denmark was a crossroads of the world. But when scientists turned their gaze to modern Danes, the contradiction struck. The foreign admixture had vanished. Today, Danes are among the most genetically uniform people in Europe. In fact, Viking DNA survives more strongly in Britain, in the former Danelaw, than in Denmark itself. How could the homeland of the Vikings lose the very legacy it exported? The reasons are haunting. Many foreign-born Vikings may never have lived long enough to pass on their genes. Countless men died in raids, their bloodlines cut short on foreign shores. Others left Denmark behind, carving lives in England, Ireland or Normandy, where their DNA spread far more successfully than at home. And in Denmark itself, a quiet force worked against them: cultural assimilation. Over generations, foreign lineages diluted into the dominant Bronze Age ancestry that had ruled for millennia. The Viking influx was real, but temporary. This is the great twist. Viking ancestry reshaped other nations far more than Denmark itself. England carries deeper Viking DNA than Copenhagen. Ireland holds traces of Norse settlers that outlast their own sagas. Even Normandy, named for the Northmen, carries blood that Denmark forgot. The Viking storm thundered abroad, but at home it faded into silence. So if Vikings didn't define Danish DNA, then what did? Thousands of years of chaos, collapse and conquest. Yet, when scientists look at modern Danes, their DNA appears almost eerily simple. The question strikes like thunder. How can a nation that endured waves of replacement, hunter-gatherers erased by farmers around 3900 BCE. Farmers overrun by steppe herders around 2850 BCE. Viking contact flooding in foreign blood by the 9th century CE. Looks so genetically uniform today? The answer lies not in survival, but in ruthless pruning. Modern Denmark is defined by just 3 dominant haplogroups. Male lineages cluster into I1, 32.8%, R1b, 37.3%, and R1a, 16.5%. Nearly 9 out of 10 Danish men descend from this triad. On the surface, it looks neat. Clean lines, tidy categories. But each of those haplogroups is a monument to collapse. Once, during the Mesolithic, Denmark was 100% Oin 2. Every man, from the Kohlbjerg skeleton around 10,000 years ago to the last hunter-gatherer fishing the Baltic, carried it. Today it lingers at less than 3%. A whole lineage nearly vanished, carved away by the farmers of Anatolia, then the riders of the steppe. And yet, this illusion of homogeneity is peculiar to Denmark. To the east, Swedes carry heavier R1a, a genetic echo of Baltic and Slavic currents. To the west, Norwegians show stronger Irish and Scottish admixture, scars of Atlantic raids and settlements. Denmark, by contrast, looks almost stripped down, its people compressed into a tighter mould, their ancient chaos flattened into order. But order built on violence is fragile. Every percentage point in those haplogroups hides extinction. Every tidy map of modern Denmark erases forgotten ancestries buried under the soil. Homogeneity is not the absence of change, it is the scar tissue of too much of it. And on Denmark's southern border, where kingdoms clashed and languages fought, the DNA refuses to stay tidy. There, identity itself blurs into something stranger still. What if German and Danish bloodlines are not separate, but reflections of one another? In Schleswig-Holstein, the border tells one story, but the bones tell another. For centuries, this land has been torn between Copenhagen and Berlin, shifting hands like a coin. In 1864, Denmark lost the duchies to Prussia after the Second Schleswig War. In 1920, a plebiscite returned the north to Denmark, while the south remained German. But the soldiers, the farmers, the fishermen, they didn't move. Their children grew up on soil their grandparents had already claimed. And the bloodlines, they never recognised the border. Walk through the parish books of southern Schleswig, and you'll find surnames ending in Sen, Jensen, Peterson, Anderson. These are Danish fingerprints scattered across German towns. They whisper that ancestry lingers long after flags have changed, and the genetics confirm it. DNA studies show Danes and northern Germans in this region are nearly indistinguishable. The haplogroups that dominate Denmark, I1, R1b, R1a, pulse just as strongly south of the line. In fact, a Dane from Jutland's southern border may share more DNA with his German neighbour than with a Dane from 5,000 years ago. That's the paradox. Time divides deeper than borders. Even archaeology testifies to this merging. At Hedeby, the great Viking emporium near today's Schleswig, graves reveal Scandinavians trading and marrying with Slavs, Saxons and Frisians. Markets overflowed with silver from the east, wine from the Rhine, furs from the north. People moved with the goods, weaving their genomes into one fabric. The supposed divide between Dane and German was always a mirror, reflecting the same blended face. And so the illusion of national purity shatters here most clearly. Borders are recent scars, identities are political performances. The genome, silent but stubborn, insists on something older, kinship, across the line. Major twist, a Dane and a German from Schleswig-Holstein today may be closer genetic kin than two Danes separated by thousands of years of replacements. And even now, with every ancient bone and every strand of DNA, archaeogenetics keeps uncovering mysteries we can't yet explain: ghost lineages, sudden disappearances, and secrets still waiting in the soil. Every discovery about Danish DNA opens two more riddles. The deeper scientists dig, the stranger the questions become. Who exactly were the first to walk into Denmark after the ice withdrew? We know of the Western hunter-gatherers and the Eastern hunter-gatherers, but the balance between them is still unclear. Was Kolbjerg man, Denmark's oldest skeleton from around 8000 BCE, part of a lost lineage, or is his genome just one flicker of a much larger, vanished population? And then the sudden rise of a ghost line, haplogroup I1. It appears almost out of nowhere in the Bronze Age around 2000 BCE. Before that, it is nearly invisible. Today it stands as the dominant paternal lineage of Scandinavia, carried by millions. But where did it come from? Was it the legacy of a single powerful clan, or the survivor of an erased people, whose blood suddenly took root in the new steppe order? The science does not yet know. Other puzzles haunt the medieval centuries. How deep was the Baltic and Slavic gene flow into Denmark, through marriage, war and trade across the Baltic Sea? Archaeologists uncover weapons and jewellery from Slavic lands in Danish graves, yet the genetic signature is faint, blurred. Were those foreigners absorbed, or did their blood vanish like so many before? Modern breakthroughs are only widening the mystery. The Allentoft 2024 study has begun sequencing hundreds of ancient Danish genomes, adding depth to the picture drawn by Eggfjord 2021 and Margarian 2020. With tools like Admix tools and TwigStats, researchers can now model Viking-era gene flows in dazzling detail. But for every lineage pinned down, another thread unravels. The truth is not a straight line. It is a maze where each discovery twists into another question. The more we learn, the more Denmark's genetic story resists closure. Its past alive, unsettled, still shifting beneath our feet. But perhaps the real question isn't about genes at all. It's about identity. If Denmark's first people vanished, if Vikings weren't pure Danes, then what does it mean to be Danish today? For over 10,000 years, Denmark's land has been a stage of erasure and rebirth. The Western hunter-gatherers, the dark-skinned, blue-eyed pioneers, gone. The Eastern hunter-gatherers, who carried tool traditions from the Urals, gone. The funnel-beaker farmers, who carved megaliths and raised livestock, swallowed by the steppe. Even the yamnaya herders, who left behind new gods, new words, and haplogroups, R1a and R1b, were later overshadowed by Bronze Age resets. Each wave left its mark in bone and soil, but not one survived intact. And yet, through these vanishings, something endured. Not DNA, not unbroken bloodlines, but culture. Denmark's national idea, its danskhed, is not anchored in chromosomes. It is anchored in story, in memory, in choice. Think of it this way: a tree grows from one root, but Denmark is no tree. It is a tapestry, woven from threads of forgotten peoples. Kolbjerg man, lying in the peat bog for 10,000 years. Funnel-beaker children buried beneath megalithic tombs around 3000 BCE. Viking warriors who carried foreign brides home from Ireland, Russia, Byzantium. Each thread was cut, rewoven, and pulled tight into something new. Modern genetics confirms what history whispers. Being Danish is not about purity, it is about survival. The Bronze Age haplogroup I1, which rose suddenly and dominates today, likely began with one man whose descendants multiplied into millions. From that fragile spark, identity outlasted extinction. The Danes are not the children of one people, they are the survivors of all. And that is the paradox. The land remembers every grave, every vanished lineage. The soil is heavy with erased ancestries, but the living Danes, unified and strikingly homogeneous in their DNA, are proof that culture can endure even when blood does not. If ancestry can vanish yet identity survives, what other nations carry ghosts in their veins, waiting to be rediscovered?